Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I'd like to talk about the books that I read in the month of July. Jane Austen July is my favorite readathon, tied with Victober, of course. July is a month I look forward to all year long, and it's such an honor to co-host Jane Austen July. So thank you to Katie for doing Jane Austen July with me, and thank you to everyone who participated as well. My highlights of the month, as always, were Jane Austen's novels themselves. I reread Emma and Pride and Prejudice for our read-alongs, which are my two favorite Austen novels. The books I read this July made it a spectacular reading month, but I also learned some valuable lessons about when to put a book down for good. More on that later. First, let's gush about the books by and about Jane Austen that I did finish. I read Emma for the third time, and I absolutely love this book. Emma is about the titular character of Emma, handsome, clever, and rich with very little to distress or vex her. She's a character who's a bit sheltered and spoiled and stubborn and snobbish, and yet somehow she's also witty and charming, and a character who I have a great regard for. After encouraging the relationship between her governess and Mr. Weston, Emma sets her sights on finding a match for her new friend Harriet, with devastating and unexpected social effects. The plot of Emma is wonderful. There are a wide array of entertaining characters and an engaging plot twist, but my favorite part of the book is the pleasure of reading about Emma herself. It's such an adventure for the reader to learn and grow alongside Emma as she becomes aware of her own actions and her own influence in the claustrophobic village of Highbury. Katie and I did a video discussion of Emma, which I will link below, that has detailed thoughts and some spoilers. Throughout the month of July, I could not stop thinking about this fantastic book. I actually considered reading it a second time in the same month, which I did not do. Instead, I supplemented my Emma cravings with the 2009 BBC version of Emma and the new 2020 version of Emma, which I actually have mixed feelings about. And I also watched Clueless, which, despite the book's transformation into a 90s rom-com, it captures the spirit of the original so well. I still want to film a video that compares these three Emma adaptations, so I will save my more detailed thoughts for that. I also read Pride and Prejudice this month as part of the read-alongs. It's one of, if not my favorite Jane Austen novel, and it was a delight to read for the fourth or possibly fifth time. Pride and Prejudice follows the Bennet family, which consists of 5 daughters and no sons. Unfortunately, without a son, the family estate is to be inherited by a distant cousin. The book focuses on the pressures that the daughters, especially the 2 elder daughters, Lizzie and Jane, feel to marry for financial security. It deals with the intricacies of navigating the Regency-era marriage market. It's just such a fun book that examines class and marriage and family in interesting ways. It's well-paced, and it features some of Austen's most interesting characters, besides Emma, of course. Reading this book is always so special and calming to me. The characters and the plot are all so familiar to me, and yet every time I reread it, I glean something new from the text, and I come up with slightly different interpretations of each of the characters, who at this point I consider to be old friends. On this reading, I was much more lenient of some of the main characters, like Lizzie and Darcy, Mrs. Bennet, and Mary. Even Caroline Bingley was not as easy to condemn this time around. I think my fairly recent reading of The Other Bennet Sister may have given me a newfound sympathy for Caroline Bingley. She was portrayed as so awful and malicious in The Other Bennet Sister that she was almost sympathetic on this reread of the original. Oddly enough, though, I took a much more negative interpretation of some of the characters that I used to have soft spots for, like Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins. You know that old quote, "You never step into the same book twice"? Well, I think that quote is never truer than when you're reading Austen. Anyway, Katie and I did an in-depth discussion of Pride and Prejudice, which was posted on her channel, if you haven't seen it yet. There are spoilers, but we discuss all sorts of themes and character interactions there as well. This month, I also read the nonfiction book that I've been meaning to read for years now, and that is Jane Austen's England, Daily Life in the Georgian and Regency Periods by Roy and Lesley Adkins. It's an in-depth discussion of Jane Austen's time period, and it's full of details about the late Georgian and early Regency periods. Each chapter is introduced with a Jane Austen quote, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and the authors use examples from Austen's life and letters to illustrate certain points in their chapters. There are all sorts of other primary sources used in the book as well to illustrate ideas of the time period. There are chapters on marriage, growing up, children, fashion, religion, leisure, crime, medicine, and so many others. And there are tons of detailed topics which fall within those categories. I personally found the section on language and accents fascinating. Apparently, within England, regional accents and dialects were so distinct at the time that even people from different counties had trouble understanding each other. And so places where people gathered from different parts of England would have been much less homogeneous than I ever realized. The Navy or boarding schools, for example, must have been really interesting places. I was also fascinated by the story of Jane's aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrot, being accused of theft. It's a story I've heard before, but I hadn't previously heard it in so much detail or understood Jane's reaction to her aunt's situation. Anyway, this book is full of interesting detail about the time period. It was well written and a joy to read if you're looking to learn about the Georgian and Regency era. It's really a great place to start, whether you're a Jane Austen fan or not. So I did not finish 2 books in the month of July. Nothing written by Jane Austen, of course. The horror of even thinking about putting one of Jane's books aside like that. Oh my goodness. The book that I DNF'd first was Sansei and Sensibility by Karen Yamashita. I was originally so excited for this book. It was supposed to be a short story collection of retellings of Austen's works that take place in the 60s and 70s in California with third-generation Japanese immigrants. The premise of the book still excites me, but I couldn't make it past the first few stories. The first story was all about very methodical traditions of Japanese bathing rituals. It honestly wasn't bad, but I found the writing style to be a bit cold, and I was heartbroken when I couldn't relate it to Jane Austen. And I really tried to connect it to Jane Austen's work. The closest I came was that it was a bit like Sense and Sensibility because they were siblings. But that's really stretching it, I think. If you handed me that short story on the average day, I would never think of Jane Austen as a possible influence in any capacity. The second story was about a dentist and his hygienist. A Japanese-American dentist who was a pillar of the local community hires a new hygienist who has this uncanny ability to tell people deep truths about themselves. These truths that she divulges while cleaning the patient's teeth deeply upsets the patients and causes them to leave the practice. This happens enough times that the dental business is struggling and practically empty. Finally, she cleans the dentist's teeth and tells him the truth about how dentistry has made him miserable and ruined his life, and that since he's been doing this for 30-some-odd years, it's okay to finally retire. The abundance of dental-related puns in this story made me constantly cringe, and it presents a very stereotyped view of dentists. Frankly, I didn't like its opinions on my chosen profession. Dentistry is hard work and challenging, but it can also be fun and rewarding, and the idea that the profession is something that will only eat away at someone and make them miserable is deeply upsetting and depressing to me. Not to mention that, again, I did not see any connection to any Jane Austen novel besides the very loose idea that it was about revealing people's true characters. I tried to force myself to read the third story, but I only got a few pages in before giving up. I saw on Goodreads that many people rated this book very highly, and others mentioned that only the second half of the book is actually related to Jane Austen. If that's true, and only the second half of the book is related to Jane Austen, why is the first half of the collection in this bind-up? To me, it just seems like Yamashita took advantage of the Jane Austen fandom to promote some of her unrelated short stories. Perhaps it's wrong of me to judge this book without having finished it. Maybe the second half of the book has stories that justify using Jane Austen's face on the cover. Maybe the second half of the book explains why the first few stories seem to have little or nothing to do with Austen. I don't know. What I do know is that I spent way too long trying to read this book and trying to become invested in this book. I tried for about a week and a half. I would only read a page or two at a time before losing interest completely. I spent too long trying to give this book a chance, just like I'm spending too long discussing it right now. Can you imagine what else I could have read during that week and a half? There are so many other wonderful Jane Austen related books out there that I just never got to this year because I was trying to force my interest in this. The other work I DNF'd was The Task by William Cowper. William Cowper was Jane Austen's favorite poet, so I was interested in seeing how his work influenced her own. It turns out that The Task is an epic poem broken up into 6 parts. I made it through the first part of the poem before deciding to stop reading it. Truthfully, I didn't understand what was happening, and I felt that there was a lot I was missing. If I had studied it in a classroom setting, The Task probably would have been a lot more compelling, but just reading through it for fun wasn't really so fun for me. It's the kind of poetry that would take a lot of work and analysis for me to make any sort of sense out of. The first book was titled The Sofa, and I gleaned that furniture was a metaphor for luxury and the evolution of the English monarchy. There were also themes of empire and colonization, with plenty of beautiful nature description. Interestingly enough, Cowper is considered one of the forerunners of Romantic poetry. Coleridge even dubbed him the best modern poet. Ironically, I love the Romantic poets, so I find it strange that I did not connect with Cowper. Like Sansei and Sensibility, I spent too much time attempting to read The Task during Jane Austen July. I don't usually DNF books. I am a firm believer that the last few pages of a book can have the power to reframe your whole understanding of the rest of the text. It's happened to me before, but I'm also beginning to understand that life is too short to read a book you aren't enjoying. And Jane Austen July was certainly too short to focus on these last 2 works that I wasn't enjoying. If I hadn't pushed myself to develop an interest in Sansei and Sensibility and The Task, perhaps I would have been able to read some other Jane Austen related books that I wanted to get to. I think I learned a valuable lesson this month, and I was still able to read my 2 favorite Austen novels, which is really what Jane Austen July is about after all. So I would love to hear about your Jane Austen July reading experience. What did you like? What did you not like? Have you read any of these books before? I keep reminding myself that I am allowed to pick up a Jane Austen book any old time of the year, and that there's always next Jane Austen July as well. So happy reading, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!